Welcome, life science learners, to another lesson. Trust that you guys are well and looking forward to our event today. Yes, it is an event. What are we looking at? We're looking at revising evolution. I know that you guys have spent a lot of time looking at the basic concepts, trying to understand the different aspects of evolution. In our lesson today, we're going to focus on revising all of those, specifically the theories, and then we'll try and unpack some of the mechanisms of evolution. As we always talk about, a revision lesson is based on reviewing the core concepts. And so during our lesson, we'll try and recap some of those concepts that underpin the main processes in evolution. A focus on the theory is important because evolution is based on trying to understand the different views that individuals like Lamarck and Darwin had spoken about. So let's try and unpack all of that in our revision lesson today. So I encourage you to get involved, make some notes, write some of those concepts down. When we get to solving some questions, I'm going to give you an opportunity to engage with those questions and hopefully then reflect on your answers as we work through them. So let's get straight into the lesson. Let's see what we have in store for you. So guys, have you ever thought about how organisms change over years? And this often underpins where we are with understanding and reflecting on evolution. So we do know that the process of evolution talks about gradual change in species over a period of time that leads to the formation of new species. And this underpins our understanding of all of evolution, that it's change over a period of time, gradually leading to progression and development of new characteristics. As an overview, we're going to spend some time talking about natural selection. It's important that when we unpack evolution that we talk about what is the evidence that supports evolution. Because evolution is often seen as a concept that is abstract, we need to support that theory with evidence. And so it's important that you understand and are able to reflect on using the different pieces of evidence to support the understanding that evolution is one explanation for life forms existing on Earth. Okay, so let's get straight into it. So some key concepts that you need to always revise. What is evolution? Again, it is the total change over time, which essentially talks about a slow process of change by which organisms acquire distinct characteristics. And the word acquire does not necessarily refer to what Lamarck mentioned, but it refers to the process of where individuals over a period of time change in their characteristics. And we'll talk about what brings those changes in a little while. A theory, we refer to evolution as being a theory. What do we mean by that? A theory is an explanation of something that has been observed in nature and which can be supported by facts, laws, and tested through a hypothesis. So, as I mentioned, evolution is a theoretical based concept. How do we support our understanding of that? As I mentioned earlier, it is done through facts, through laws, as well as evidence that is able to support that explanation. So let's look at that in a bit of detail. We also know that variation is crucial to driving change. And we talk about a variation as being the differences in characteristics between individuals of the same species. So I'd like to pause at this moment and again step back and ask you to reflect on what is it that drives evolution. When we think about that, guys, we often think about factors that are external. However, if we consider what happens in any population, we see that there are differences between individuals, and these differences make some individuals different to others. And those differences give some individuals a better chance at surviving. The question is, what makes individuals different? And that can be reflected on several topics that we've looked at. In the past, we've looked at meiosis, and we know that those random realignment of chromosomes along the equator, we spoke about crossing over. Those are the factors that actually create variation amongst the gametes. So variation is important in what drives change in species. Guys, as we wrap this part of the segment up, the theory of evolution by natural selection is based on 5 key observations. Those key observations are that in each generation, populations produce more offsprings that are necessary or than there are adults. So you'll find that a pair of individuals that mate produce a large number of offsprings. What's key to that? The next is that populations do not continue to grow in size. Okay? They do not constantly grow in size. You'll find that there's a gradual increase, but it's not a constant increase, because at some point individuals die as they become old, or the weak die because they're not better suited. Sick and old also die. So we know that what we refer to as the carrying capacity in the environment often remains stable. Food and many other resources are generally limited in the population, meaning that we find that generally there's some kind of competition for food. And this means that individuals within the population also have characteristics that make them different. And those individuals that are different sometimes have a better chance at surviving. And if they do survive, they then pass down those variations to the next generation. And so that's the key observations around natural selection. What does this mean? So when we take those key observations, what can we infer from that? We can infer that these 3 concepts of many offsprings, populations grow in size, and that they are limited resource point to that individuals within a population compete for resources, meaning that there is competition. And this competition promotes survival of the fittest. When we look at these 2 concepts at the bottom, we know that some individuals will inherit some characteristics that give them a better chance of surviving and reproducing. And this in turn means that over a period of time, populations change to becoming better suited to the environment, and they then pass down those characteristics from one generation to the next, eventually leading to progression of populations becoming better suited to the environment. And that is essentially what underpins the concept of survival of the fittest and natural selection. Guys, as we wrap this segment up, let's very quickly recap what are the different pieces of evidence that supports evolution. We've mentioned in the past biogeographic distribution of species, and that essentially points to how they are distributed on Earth and the significance that similar species of individuals around different continents share a common ancestor. The next concept is genetic similarities. The basic building block of DNA is the same in every species. What does that point to? It points to probably an ancestral species that gave individuals or different individuals the same genetic makeup. We also must not forget that we have homologous structures, structures that are similar in structure but different in function. So we talk about the pentadactyl limb, the 5-digited arm. So the pentadactyl limb, which is similar, and that all points to a common ancestor from which these species or these forms of life have all diverged from. Finally, we have fossil records. Again, fossil records points to the existence of past life forms, and by studying that, we can understand how organisms existed in the past and progressively how they have changed and have become different or better suited to different environments. Variation is key to driving evolution, and we must mention that variation is brought about during meiosis, where we spoke of crossing over happening. We also know that there is random arrangements of chromosomes that occur during metaphase 1 and metaphase 2, and this in turn creates variation amongst the gametes. We must also note that mutations are sudden random changes in the genetic makeup that produces variation, and that variation often gives individuals different characteristics, either giving them an advantage or not. And so if it is a useful mutation, they continue to survive. If it is harmful, you'll find that sometimes it eliminates those individuals from the population. And sometimes we also see that they are neutral or really don't affect the species or the individual. Finally, we talk about random mating between individuals, which creates random copies or random offsprings that have variation. So the randomness of mating produces variation. And finally, when individuals mate, there is a large number of gametes produced by the male and the female. And so those random fertilization processes that occur create several possibilities in the offsprings. And so if you compare yourself to your siblings, you will notice that even though you have the same set of parents, you often look different, you have variation from them. Likewise, if you look at animals, when they produce many offsprings at a given time, dogs and cats, you'll find that there's lots of variation amongst them. And so essentially, that is what drives evolution, the variation that exists in a species. Guys, that was an overview of the initial concepts around natural selection. We looked at the different pieces of evidence that supports that process of evolution. And finally, now we've unpacked what variation is and how that drives change. Let's have a little break, and when we get back, we will spend some time looking at the different theories. See you in a bit. Welcome back, Life Science learners. Let's continue with our lesson today. A recap of what we've just looked at. We've been looking at revising evolution. We've spent some time looking at the basic concept of evolution. We spoke about the 5 principles that underpin natural selection. We looked at some evidence that underpins what facts we use to support evolution as a theory. We've also mentioned that evolution is driven by variation, and we looked at variation as being in meiosis, M for meiosis, M for mutations, which happen during DNA replication, or the randomness of mutations that happen elsewhere during protein synthesis. We also spoke about variations that occur during, if you remember, random fertilization, as well as the random formation of gametes and mates. So that was the randomness of mutations and variation that brings about change and drives evolution. Now let's look at Lamarck's theory and unpack what Lamarck's theory is. So when we talk of Lamarckism or Lamarck's theory, what often comes to mind is the law of use and disuse. And essentially, if we were to put that into a very short, abbreviated statement, it would mean that the more you use something, the better it becomes. And that is what Lamarck put together, the law of use and disuse. And he also inferred that structures or parts that were not used gradually lost their functional use. And so some people often believe that that is true. And so let's test that. Let's unpack the theory. Okay, so he mentioned repeated use of augments would cause it to enlarge and become more efficient. The disuse of an organ would cause it to degenerate. Guys, if we look at these images here, we can see up here, we can see the ancestral shape of the head of the elephant, and we can see that gradually over a period of time that the tusks of these elephants have become longer. So the question is, did it become longer because they used it more often? Or did it disappear because they stopped using it? And so often we think about, well, it kind of makes sense that if we want to use something, the better it becomes. However, guys, think about those things that happen to you. So if you go to gym and if you decide to exercise and if you become really muscular because you've used your arms to exercise, does that mean that when you decide to have the next generation, will they be born strong and muscular like you are? Often not, because that would be something that they would have to train to become, as you would have. So the things that happen to you during a lifetime may not necessarily happen to the next generation purely because they are born as an offspring to you. And that is what Lamarck was pointing to. So let's try and unpack that. So the law of use and disuse essentially points to changes in the environment create needs that cause organisms to modify their existing organs to meet the need. Lamarck did mention that the environment constantly changed, or that there was a selection pressure from the environment, meaning that the environment was not always the same and individuals had to change, either try and reach fruit higher up or had to adapt structures to better survive. So he mentioned that the modifications of an organism acquired during its lifetime could be passed on to its offspring. So essentially, if an individual, as for the example of the giraffes, constantly stretched and tried to reach the fruit higher up, that their necks grew longer. And guys, I challenge you to do that. I mean, if you were using something constantly, yes, it does become better. But the question is, will that characteristic that you acquire, that you get, be passed on to the next generation? Very unlikely. Why? Because characteristics that happen to you or changes that happen to you need to be genetically passed down. And so the genetic inheritance needs to be what drives the inheritance of characteristics from one generation to the next. And unfortunately, Lamarck was not able to convince people using his theory of acquired characteristics. So let's look at his theory. So again, why was his theory rejected? And the concept of rejection is based on not enough evidence supporting what he hypothesized. And so we need to unpack why is it that it is rejected. So organisms do not evolve because they were determined to change by changes that take place randomly due to mutations. Essentially, that points to that individuals don't change because they need to change. Change happens randomly, and that is driven by mutations. So things that happen randomly are not controlled by an individual. Yes, you might exercise to become better, but that is an acquired characteristic that you get. That cannot be passed down to the next generation purely because you've acquired that trait. Likely, all acquired characteristics cannot be inherited. What does that mean? It means that the phenotype changes that affect the genotype, as discovered later by Mendel, cannot be inherited. Let me put that into a simple context again. So what happens to you if you decide to go and get a tan in the sun, or if you were sitting out and getting burnt in the sun? Does that mean that the next generation will be born with darker skin? Unfortunately not, because what you've acquired physically as a darker skin color will not be passed on to the next generation. The next generation inherits your genetic information from the sperm or the egg cell. Cool. So Lamarck's theory, remember the following, guys, that an inherited characteristic is a characteristic an offspring is born with. So a characteristic can only be passed down from the parents through genes, and that comes from the gametes, the sperms and the eggs when they fertilize. Having been inherited from one of the parents, a characteristic is controlled by a factor called gene. Back in the day, Lamarck and Darwin were not able to coin what the term gene was. Much later on, when Mendel unpacked the factor that was used to inherit characteristic, was the term gene coined. So it was very difficult back in the day for Lamarck and Darwin to actually use the word gene as a concept of inheritance. Today we understand that, and hence we can explain this concept much more scientifically. We also need to understand that an acquired characteristic is a characteristic that an offspring is not born with, but develops or is acquired through the course of its lifetime and are not controlled by a gene. The guiding question when Lamarck's theory is applied to a new situation is the following. What was the original characteristic? What was the challenge that allowed that characteristic to become better suited to the environment? What did the organism do, or what did that characteristic then acquire? And so the things that happen in an individual's life, what was the factor that contributed to that? And hence Lamarck had these questions which he posed. Further guided questions are, what was the result of that selection pressure? Did it cause the next generation to change? And so what happens to the acquired characteristic? Does it then pass on from one generation to the next and to the next, eventually leading to them becoming better or better suited to the environment? And so what was the result of this? And unfortunately, this cannot be supported by the fact that the more some part is used, the better it becomes. Today we understand that genes control the inheritance of characteristics and that mutation drives the change. Let's unpack a bit more. So here's a question that we'll try and wrap this segment up with. Jean-Baptiste de Lamarck was a French naturalist who proposed his theory of evolution in 1809. Name the two ideas on which Lamarck's theory was based. And guys, if we unpack those two ideas, we spoke about his theory of use and disuse. And secondly, the inheritance of acquired characteristics. Okay? So those were the two concepts, the theory of use and disuse and his theory of the inheritance of acquired characteristics. Another question. Give two reasons why most scientists reject his theory. And guys, it's important that you're able to identify for two reasons, two well-explained reasons why his theory was rejected. Let's unpack the answer to this question. One reason was that acquired characteristics are not inherited. We know that the only way a characteristic can be inherited is through genes, and clearly he was not able to convince people around that. Secondly, organisms do not evolve because they want to evolve. Individuals don't change because they want to. Change happens because of things that go wrong or go right, so mutations, random fertilization, or the randomness of gametes being fused, and that is what drives change in species. One more question. Was Lamarck's work entirely without value because his theory had been rejected? Interesting question. The answer is no, guys. It is laid on the foundation that traits could be passed down to offsprings, and he attempted to explain how and why species had changed. And from those, he had evidence from fossil records. However, his explanation of that was not conclusive based on his theory that the more some characteristic was used, the better it developed. Welcome back, life science learners. Let's continue with our revision lesson on evolution. We're going to unpack what Darwin's theory of natural selection was. We're going to try and unpack some questions as we try and understand how to apply his theory. Let's get straight into the lesson and unpack what Darwin mentioned in his theory of natural selection. So guys, it's important that when we look at Darwin's theory of natural selection, we remember the different components that unpack the theory of natural selection. Before I get to the board, let me pause at this point. It's important that we recognize that when Darwin tried to explain his concept of natural selection, he mentioned a few principles. One was that individuals produce offsprings more than necessary. Often you see that in the wild, individuals produce a large number of offsprings. We also know that amongst the offsprings, that they show lots of variation, and that's again the randomness of gametes fertilizing. So we see that they produce large number of offspring. We also know that amongst the offspring they show lots of variation. The third concept is that amongst the offsprings, some access resources better than others. Essentially, we're saying that some individuals are better suited to accessing resources or food from the environment. Those individuals that are able to access resources are better suited and survive. When they do survive, they are able to reproduce. Because they're able to reproduce, they often pass down those favorable traits, eventually passing down characteristics from one generation to the next that have given them an advantage. And that is essentially what underpins natural selection. Let's try and put that together as a review. So, as I mentioned, most species, they produce large number of offsprings throughout their lifetime. Amongst the offsprings, there's variation. The offsprings of the same species show a great deal of variation amongst them. As I mentioned, the third concept was that there is competition. The offsprings generally compete with each other for food, shelter, resources, etc. And that's healthy. You'll find that amongst the offspring, some of them have certain characteristics that benefit them or give them an advantage. Some might be a little taller, some might be a bit faster, some might be short and able to access food quickly from the ground. And so we see that variation, some offsprings survive because they have a trait that makes them more suitable to the environment. Essentially, it gives them an advantage at accessing resources better than others. Those that are able to survive, are able to produce offsprings, are generally fewer than the large group that were produced. So we say that there's been some selection pressure where some individuals that are better suited survive. What does that mean? It means that those that have survived pass down the genetic characteristics to their offsprings in turn. Because they're able to survive, they were stronger in accessing resources. They in turn grow to become adults that reproduce. And purely because they're able to reproduce means that they are able to pass down some of those favorable characteristics. And we say that natural selection means that those organisms with the most beneficial traits or the best suited are more likely to survive and reproduce. And so that is essentially what underpins natural selection. Those individuals that are better suited to the environment, surviving, accessing resources, reproducing, and passing down those favorable traits. And in inverted commas, we often say survival of the fittest. Let's go further into unpacking what Darwin said. So natural selection essentially points to, from generation to generation, the populations gradually change and lead to the evolution of a new species. And this we see a gradual process of individuals changing, being better suited to the environment, and that leads to what we refer to as a process of speciation, formation of a new species. Guys, Darwin's theory also pointed to that species were not created in the present form, but evolved from an ancestral form. Essentially what that points to is that it points to any species that currently exist has not suddenly appeared. It's important that we recognize that in order for a new species to form, it would have had to form from a pre-existing one. Essentially, all life forms have in some way or the other descended from something that previously existed. Let's unpack that. I'll repeat the statement again. Species were not created in their present forms, but have evolved from the ancestral species. And that essentially points to what I refer to as the tree of life, is that individuals have gradually developed from one generation to the next, or from one species to the next, becoming different, becoming better, suited to the environment. And so essentially we need to recognize that in this simple illustration, that this current species that exists evolved from something that existed in the past. Essentially, the argument would be that this species no longer exists and has resulted in some change that has developed into a new species. And often that is what fossil records show us. It shows us an existing form of life that is currently not present. But we see similarities between what is currently living and what has recently become extinct, recent as in a few million years. And we often see development of complexity from a past life form, from a fossil, to a more developed species that is currently living. And so that is what essentially underpins Darwin's theory of natural selection. In an experiment to his explanation, Darwin talks about in a population of mice that have moved to a new area where the rocks are very dark in color. Due to natural selection, the genetic variation present, some mice are black and some mice are tan. So in this illustration, we can clearly see that there's an equal number of mice that are black in color and tan in color. The selection pressure here is the predator bird that's going to feed on these mice. When we look at the variation that exists amongst these mice, some are brightly colored or tan in color, others are darker. As you would notice that these individuals are difficult to spot because they blend in. So it's not that they have become better, it's purely because of a variation that they have. However, these light colored or tan colored mice are much more easily visible, and so they become an easy, soft target. Gradually over time, we'll find that the distribution and the numbers of these individuals have rapidly decreased, purely because their selection pressure of being lighter colored reduced their chance of being camouflaged. This means that these individuals that are more suited to the environment, namely the black color mice, have a greater chance of surviving. And so we find that gradually over a period of time, that the number of these, or the distribution of their numbers, have significantly changed. Now we find that there is a smaller proportion of your light colored or your tan colored mice, and we find a larger proportion. And so essentially what we're seeing is that through variation that exists in a population and through the selection pressure, which is in this case from the environment, those individuals that have a characteristic that give them an advantage or allow them to be better suited survive, reproduce, and produce more offsprings. And this essentially can lead to what we refer to the formation of a new species that is predominantly, in this case, best suited to the environment. And this is essentially what underpins natural selection, the ability of individuals to change, adapt, and survive, leading to the formation of a new species. So as we wrap this segment up, Darwin's theory talks about the great deal of variation amongst the offsprings, and that we know that some of these give individuals favorable characteristics, whereas others do not. And we've seen that the light-colored mice do not have that feature. When there is a change in the environment or a selection pressure, which I refer to as being the predator bird, that is the selection pressure, where some of them are less likely to survive while others survive. And we see that those organisms with the favorable characteristic, in this case being dark and better suited to being less seen or better camouflage, these make them better suited to the conditions and they survive. Gradually, those individuals with the unfavorable characteristics, their numbers decrease and they are most likely to die to a point that their numbers become significantly low. We then say that the organisms that have survived, the darker colored mice, again reproduce, pass down those alleles to the next generation, leading to the offsprings having more of that specific trait. Finally, we see that the next generation will therefore have a higher proportion of individuals with that favorable characteristic. And as I mentioned, when we compare that to what has happened in the example, we notice that gradually, over a short period of time, we see that there's an increase in the distribution or the frequency of the dark colored mice. Guys, there are many examples of such processes of evolution that currently we see. One example is the peppered moth that we noticed during the Industrial Revolution. And that showed a significant change in the distribution of peppered moths as the Industrial Revolution proceeded. We see that individuals best suited to the environment, purely because of their dark color, were less likely to be eaten by birds. And so, before the Industrial Revolution, the light-colored peppered moth numbers were significantly larger. Over a few decades, the number and the distribution of the dark-colored peppered moths had significantly increased, and the light-colored peppered moths had decreased. So here we're seeing individuals having variation that gives them an advantage at surviving, changing the frequency of a specific trait in the population. Guys, that was an overview of Darwin's theory of natural selection, trying to unpack that in relation to different examples. Let's have a little break, and when we get back, we'll apply our understanding to a few questions. See you in a bit. Welcome back, guys. Let's wrap up our discussion around revision in evolution. We've just looked at Lamarck's theory, we've unpacked Darwin's theory, we've had a sense of what does it mean to apply Darwin's theory in using that in different examples to explain how species have formed. In this segment, we're going to apply that to understanding how to answer a few questions. We'll also try and unpack some concepts such as punctuated equilibrium and gradualism. Let's get straight into some application-based questions. The question reads, in a population of mice, half were light in color and half were dark. So if we look at that, there's probably an equal distribution of your dark and light colored mice in a population. Okay, so we see that that's an example of that. If owls hunt in the area at night, which mice have the more favorable characteristics? So we often refer to individuals having variation. Again, we see variation amongst the mice. Some are dark colored, some are brightly colored. An owl is a bird that preys or catches its food at night. It's nocturnal. It is adapted to being able to see better at night. However, these mice also feed at night because it's probably ideal for them to access food when many of the predators are away. Having a different color of coat gives some individuals a better advantage or not necessarily an advantage. In this case, these individuals against the dark surface or at night are more likely to be seen by the owls. So we'll find that the individuals that have a darker color, in this case the darker mice, will be less likely to be seen. And you know that, guys, at night it's difficult to see things that are dark in color. And hence, if you have a bright color on, you're more visible. To the disadvantage of these mice, being brightly colored gives them a disadvantage because they're most likely to be visible or seen easily by the predator. So, the answer to this question would be, guys, we'll find that the owls that are able to see at night are most likely going to target the white colored or the bright colored mice. And the ones that are less likely to survive, or more likely to survive, will be the dark colored mice. And that is essentially the concept that underpins natural selection. Why? Because they will be difficult to be seen against the dark background. And this in turn means that they will be better camouflaged at night, which in turn means that they're able to access resources. Gradually over a period of time, they're able to reproduce and produce more individuals that are better suited to that environment. Unlike the light-colored mice, there will be a fewer individuals that survive. They're likely to reproduce, and if they do, they produce more offsprings, having that characteristic, again an unfavorable characteristic. Hence, over a period of time, the distribution in the numbers of dark-colored mice and your light-colored mice would radically change. The dark-colored becoming significantly more and the light-colored becoming significantly less. And that is what causes what we refer to as the difference in the distribution within a species, to a point that we have natural selection favoring a particular type of individual based on a characteristic they have. Let's unpack another question. If the predator was a snake that detects the body heat of its prey, which mice would probably have the more favorable variation? So now, guys, we're talking about a change in the selection pressure. So previously, in that other question, we looked at the predator bird, which was an owl, and its ability to see individuals at night was based on their color of their fur. Now we're looking at a different selection pressure. Here we have a snake that relies on being able to sense the heat from its prey. We know that if we compare individuals that are darker skinned or have a dark color, they're more likely to absorb more heat from the sun during the day. However, the light-colored individuals will reflect the heat. So purely based on that, there is a likelihood that the dark-colored mice would have absorbed more heat and will probably radiate more heat to their surroundings. And that in turn means that if we look at a predator that detects body heat, it's most likely going to pick up the darker colored mice. And now we see that there's a selection pressure that now changes or favors having a light colored skin, or in this case, fur. So the light colored mice are more likely to be not visible. And you'll find that, and that's because we know that, as I explained, the light colors absorb less heat than the dark colors, and hence their numbers will gradually increase over a period of time if the selection pressure of this, in this case, the snake numbers increase in that particular environment. The next question, let's look at that. Tabulate two differences between the theories of Charles Darwin and Lamarck. Guys, this is a favorite question that often comes up. It is a question that often challenges you on your ability to be able to differentiate the theories that Lamarck had put forward and Darwin had put forward. So it's an important question that you must practice and make sure that you have the notes for this type of question. Let's read that. It says tabulate, and the word tabulate essentially points to putting things together in a table. Remember that a table needs to have a heading. It also needs to have clear columns that clearly differentiate between what you're comparing. I also would like to pause here and give you context to what a comparison is. Guys, it's important that comparisons need to be relative to each other. When comparing two objects, you cannot compare the size of an object to the color of an object. That is not a relative comparison. You've got to compare realistically a characteristic in relation to the other. So the classical example is you've got a big cat and you've got a brown cat. There's a big difference in that comparison. We've got to compare, as I mentioned, the characteristic relative to each other. So let's try and look at what is the answer for this question. So I've put that into a table, and we know that Lamarck spoke of members of the population are the same. However, Darwin mentioned that there was lots of variation within the population that he referred to as variation in the species. Lamarck mentioned that individuals are able to change or transform during their lifetime. Darwin, on the other hand, mentioned that transformation took a longer period of time and only through genetic means. Essentially, the changes that happen were through genetic characteristics being inherited and not through an attempt of trying to change, which is essentially a transformation process that we see. We also note that individuals choose which traits to pass on to the offsprings, and changes are directed to meet survival. And that's what Lamarck said, is that it was an intentional process, that individuals changed to suit the environment. However, Darwin mentioned that natural selection favored individuals and that there was a selection pressure causing change and individuals to become different. Right. As we wrap this segment up, there's a nice question that I'd like to get into, and it reads, the maned wolf is the closest living relative of the now extinct Falkland wolf. The maned wolf lives in a habitat of very tall grass in South America. The wolf has a reddish fur with black legs and rotating ears. The maned wolf has an exceptionally long legs, as you see in the image on the top right hand side, and believed to be an adaptation for seeing or looking over the tall grass and look out for its potential prey. So these adaptations are significant for, one, its habitat. And so these are unique to its habitat. The question that I'd like to wrap this section up with is, explain the long legs of the maned wolf using the theory of evolution by natural selection. And guys, this is a typical question that you would get where you've got to explain the theory using an example. Again, it is pinned by the 4 or 5 concepts that we discussed, that individuals produce offsprings. Amongst the offsprings, we see variation. In this case, we see that there's variation in the length of the limbs. Amongst them, these have a better chance of being able to find prey or food or see predators. Having shorter legs gave individuals a disadvantage. The favorable characteristic was then passed on, and those that had short legs could not find prey and did not pass on their traits, so they died. And so we see that gradually over a period of time, the wolf with long legs could find prey, they survived easier, they produced more offsprings, gradually leading to the number of these individuals increasing. And guys, that's how you would have to use that theory of natural selection to explain the existence of species that currently have survived. We can also use the example of natural selection to explain how cheetahs have evolved. So guys, your understanding of evolution is based on the concepts. Go back, review the concepts, look at these concepts and understand that these concepts can be tested in different scenarios. You should have a list of terms that underpin your understanding. I trust that you've enjoyed the lesson and that you've appreciated the engagement that we've had. From my side, have a good day. See you soon. Cheers.